March 28, 1942. The mouth of the Loire estuary occupied France. A single British destroyer was sailing directly into the most heavily defended port in Nazi-occupied Europe, stuffed with 4.5 tons of explosives, concealed behind a false wall of concrete. Alongside her, 18 small wooden motorboats carried 265 commandos, whose mission was to tear apart Germany's most valuable naval facility from the inside. The Germans had more than 5,000 troops defending Saint-Nazaire. They had searchlights, coastal artillery, anti-aircraft guns, torpedo boats, and the natural advantage of a heavily silted estuary that was nearly impossible to navigate in darkness. The British force was small, lightly armed, and travelling in boats made of mahogany. What they had instead was a plan so audacious, so deliberately reckless, that the Germans simply couldn't believe anyone would attempt it. This is the Nazaire Raid, Operation Chariot, the night when a condemned destroyer became the most expensive torpedo in history and changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're covering the operation that military historians have called the greatest raid of all time. Not because of its scale, it was by any measure a small action, but because of what it achieved, how it achieved it, and the extraordinary courage of the men who carried it out. But before we get to that Loire estuary, before we watch a burning destroyer ram Germany's prize dock at 20 knots, we need to understand why this operation was necessary. Because without knowing the threat that Britain faced in the spring of 1942, you can't appreciate what made Saint-Nazaire so absolutely essential. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe. We cover the battles and operations that define Britain, the moments when courage, ingenuity, and cold-blooded determination changed history. Let's go back to 1941 to the Tirpitz. Germany's largest and most powerful warship was the sister ship of the Bismarck. 50,000 tons of armoured steel, 8 15-inch guns, and virtually impervious to anything the Royal Navy could throw at her in a straight fight. Winston Churchill called the Tirpitz the Beast and described her as the single greatest obstacle to British naval strategy in the entire war. She didn't even need to leave harbour to be effective. Simply by existing in Norwegian fjords, she forced the Royal Navy to keep capital ships tied up watching her, ships that were desperately needed in the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and the Atlantic. But the Tirpitz had one weakness. If she was going to operate in the North Atlantic, hunting convoys, threatening invasion routes, doing what her designers intended, she would eventually need repairs and maintenance. A ship of her size required a dry dock of extraordinary dimensions, and by 1942 there was exactly one such facility on the entire Atlantic coast of occupied Europe, the Normandy dock at Saint-Nazaire. The Normandy dock had been built before the war specifically to accommodate the great French ocean liner SS Normandy. It was 1,148 feet long, 164 feet wide, sealed by an enormous steel and concrete caisson, a floating gate, 35 feet thick. Destroy that caisson, and the Tirpitz could never safely venture into the Atlantic. She would be permanently confined to Norwegian waters, neutralised without ever having to be sunk. British planners had already ruled out aerial bombardment. The dock was too well protected, the bombing accuracy of the era too unreliable, and the risk to French civilians too great. There was only one way to do it. Someone had to go in and blow it up from the inside. Combined Operations Headquarters, under Lord Mountbatten, devised a plan that everyone involved admitted was extremely likely to result in total catastrophe. The heart of the plan was HMS Campbelltown, a 20-year-old American destroyer transferred to Britain under the Lend-Lease Agreement. She was obsolete, she was expendable. Her crew knew it. Campbelltown would be stripped down to reduce her draft, disguised to look like a German torpedo boat. 2 of her 4 funnels removed, the remaining 2 cut at angles to resemble German silhouettes, and packed with 4.5 tons of amatol explosive concealed beneath the deck. She would sail straight into Saint-Nazaire and ram the dock gates at full speed. After that, the commandos would do the rest. The naval force was commanded by Commander Robert Ryder. The military force, the 2nd Commando and elements of other units, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Charles Newman. Newman was a civil engineer in peacetime, a man who understood exactly what the commandos needed to destroy. Together they had 18 motor launches, a gunboat, a torpedo boat, and Campbelltown herself, against St. Nazaire's 5,000 defenders. If you had been shown that plan in March 1942, what would you have said? Suicidal? Insane? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because every officer who read it said more or less exactly that, and then volunteered anyway. The force left Falmouth on the evening of March 26th, sailing far into the Bay of Biscay to avoid German air patrols before turning toward the Loire. For 2 days they maintained submarine watches, avoided German aircraft, and tried not to think too carefully about what awaited them. On the night of March the 27th, 28, they entered the Loire estuary and began the most dangerous part of the approach. The estuary was heavily silted, with a narrow, navigable channel that even experienced Loire pilots found treacherous. The Germans considered it a natural barrier. They were about to be proven wrong. At 0100 on March 28th, German searchlights found the British fleet. For a few agonising seconds, everything hung in the balance. Then the British signaller on the gunboat MGB 314, using captured German codes, began transmitting. He identified the fleet as friendly vessels returning to port, urgently requested that the searchlights stand down, and cited the correct German recognition signals. The German batteries hesitated. Commanders reached for their phones, checking the signals against their codebooks. The hesitation cost them precious minutes. Campbelltown, with 18-year-old Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty at the helm, kept her course. She was now close enough that the German guns, once they opened fire, would be shooting at point-blank range. The Germans finally opened fire at 0127. Every gun in St. Nazaire that could bear came alive simultaneously. Sailors and commandos on the open decks of the motor launches had nowhere to hide. The wooden boats offered no protection whatsoever. Men died at their posts. Boats caught fire, but Campbelltown accelerated. At 0134, 4 minutes behind schedule, Campbelltown hit the southern caisson of the Normandy dock at 20 knots. The impact drove her bow 30 feet into the steel gate and locked her there. Lieutenant Commander Beatty looked at his watch. Then he ordered the ship abandoned. The commandos were already moving. Before the smoke had settled, teams were over the side and running for their objectives across the dock complex. These men had spent months studying scale models of St. Nazaire, practicing their individual routes until they could have run them blind. Each team carried up to 90 pounds of plastic explosive. Each team had a specific target: pump houses, winding gear, hydraulic machinery, and a specific time window in which to complete their work and reach the evacuation point. The demolition teams worked in the chaos with extraordinary precision. The pump stations that drained the dock were destroyed with charges placed against their most vulnerable components. The winding gear that operated the dock gates was put permanently out of action. The power systems, the hydraulics, the mechanisms that made the Normandy dock function, team by team, charge by charge, they were obliterated. But the evacuation was falling apart. The motor launches that were supposed to carry the commandos back to the waiting ships were taking catastrophic losses in the harbour. The German gunners, initially caught off guard by the audacity of the British approach, had recovered their composure. The wooden boats offered no protection against the 20mm cannon and machine gun fire now pouring into the harbour from every direction. Launch after launch caught fire or sank. Crews who survived their boat's destruction swam in burning harbour water. Newman, still ashore with the bulk of his commandos, received the message that evacuation by sea was no longer possible. He gathered his remaining men, roughly 200, and told them what had to be done. They were in the middle of an occupied French port, surrounded by 5,000 German troops, with no way out by sea. "Do your best to get back to England," Newman told them. "Don't give in while you have ammunition, and if possible, don't give in at all." What followed was one of the most extraordinary small unit actions in British military history. Newman led his commandos through the streets of St. Nazaire, fighting house to house, using darkness and aggression to punch through German blocking positions. They used captured German weapons when their own ammunition ran out. They covered for each other, dragged their wounded, and kept moving. Eventually they were surrounded and forced to surrender, but not before they had done everything asked of them, and considerably more. Of the 611 men who left Falmouth, only 228 returned to Britain. The other 383 were killed or captured. The motor launches had paid the heaviest price. Of the 18 that entered the estuary, only 4 made it back. The losses were devastating. And yet the operation was not over. The Germans, confident that the raid had been repulsed with heavy British losses, spent the morning of March 28th examining their captured prize. Senior officers toured the beached Campbelltown. Engineers inspected the damage to the dock gates. German soldiers clambered about on the destroyer's deck, some of them posing for photographs. Campbelltown had been rammed into the dock at 0134. It was now approaching mid-morning. No one had found the explosives. At 10:35, the Amatol detonated. The blast killed approximately 360 people on and around the ship, including 40 German officers who had gathered on the dock for an inspection. The caisson was destroyed. The dock gates were blown apart. The Normandy dock flooded instantly and catastrophically. The wreckage of Campbelltown was driven deep into the dock itself, blocking it completely. Germany's prized dry dock, the only facility in Atlantic-occupied Europe capable of servicing the Tirpitz, would not operate again until 1948. Here is the question that every student of this operation eventually asks. What about the commandos who died or were captured? Was it worth it? 383 men who didn't come home in exchange for a dry dock. How do you weigh that? The answer, I think, is found not in the arithmetic of casualties, but in the consequences of the alternative. The Tirpitz, denied her only Atlantic sanctuary, remained in Norwegian fjords for the rest of her existence. She never successfully operated against Atlantic convoys. The fear she generated was never matched by the destruction she caused, precisely because she could never safely leave. The 35,000 British and Allied troops and the millions of tons of supplies that crossed the Atlantic between 1942 and 1945 did so in waters that Tirpitz never entered. Every one of those men, every one of those ships, owed something to the 611 men who sailed up the Loire on a March night. The strategic impact extended further than the dock itself. Hitler, stunned that the Allies had penetrated one of his most heavily defended positions, immediately diverted thousands of troops from the Eastern Front to reinforce Atlantic coastal defences. The Atlantic Wall was dramatically expanded as a direct response to St. Nazaire. Every German soldier guarding a French beach was a German soldier not fighting in Russia. The German psychological shock was genuine and profound. They had believed their defences impregnable. They had believed that no force small enough to evade detection could be large enough to cause serious damage. St. Nazaire proved them wrong on both counts simultaneously. The Allies could reach anywhere. The Germans could not relax anywhere. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded for Operation Chariot, one of the highest concentrations of the nation's supreme honour for any single operation in British military history. Commander Ryder received his for directing the naval operation under devastating fire, refusing to withdraw until his men were either evacuated or beyond his ability to help. Lieutenant Colonel Newman received his for leading the ground force with a personal courage that gave his men the confidence to keep fighting when all rational calculation said to stop. Lieutenant Commander Beatty received his for steering Campbelltown into the dock gates with the precision of a man docking in peacetime, while every German gun in the harbour tried to kill him. Sergeant Thomas Durrant received his Victoria Cross posthumously for something that speaks to the particular character of this operation. Durrant, manning a Lewis gun on one of the motor launches, came under direct fire from a German destroyer. Hit more than 20 times, he continued firing. He would not stop. He would not surrender. When the German destroyer's captain finally took him prisoner, the man was so moved by Durrant's courage that he reported it personally to the British authorities after the war, specifically requesting that Durrant be decorated. An enemy officer going out of his way to ensure his opponent received recognition for bravery against him. That says something about the quality of the men involved. Able seaman William Savage died at his gun on MGB 314. The gunboat that had broadcast the deceptive German signals and led the fleet into the harbour. He was manning an exposed pom-pom gun with no cover, engaging targets that vastly outgunned him, enabling the boats behind him to press forward. He was killed during the withdrawal. The dock at St. Nazaire still bears the evidence of what happened on March the 28th, 1942. A memorial stands there today, inscribed with the names of the men who didn't come home. The French remember it as an act of liberation, as much as an act of war, because the commandos moved through their streets not as an occupying force, but as men fighting for freedom, trying to help end an occupation the French people endured every day. The men who carried out Operation Chariot were not all professional soldiers. Many were civilians who had volunteered for the commandos because they wanted to fight, and found that regular soldiering didn't give them enough opportunity to do so. They were builders and clerks and teachers and farmers who happened to be extraordinarily fit and willing to be trained to an exceptional standard. The British amateur tradition, the gifted non-professional who rises to the moment, runs through this operation like a thread. Newman was a civil engineer. Some of his best demolition men were peacetime professionals who understood the machinery they were being asked to destroy. They brought knowledge to the raid that no purely military education could have provided. The Normandy dock was destroyed not just by courage, but by expertise, by men who understood exactly which bolt, which coupling, which pressure point would render an entire system irretrievably useless. Operation Chariot succeeded because it combined the daring of Nelson with the patience of an engineer. The plan was preposterous on its face, and precise in every detail underneath. It required that everything go exactly right for 5 minutes, and that the men involved be capable of improvising brilliantly when everything then went wrong, which it did, and they were. A disguised destroyer, a floating bomb, wooden boats in a defended harbour, and 265 men who simply refused to stop until their job was done. This is the kind of story that doesn't need embellishment. It stands on its own. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, operations defined by moral courage as much as physical bravery, moments when a small number of determined individuals changed the outcome of a war, then you know what to do. Britain's history exists because these stories deserve to be told properly. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling them. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the stories that mattered told the way they deserved.